Thank you, Marion. Well, I think everyone knows that we are in the fifth book of Moses, Deuteronomy. And I think I mentioned before that the original word, the original title of Deuteronomy was in English, these are the words. But slowly they took over. It was then called the repetition of the Torah, because remember now Moses in this book of Deuteronomy is reminding the Israelites of everything they've been through in the 40 years of wandering. He's reminding them of every place they visited. He's reminding them of their mistakes, their sins, and how he begged Hashem to forgive them, and how they themselves asked for forgiveness. And each time they had that forgiveness. They were redeemed, if you like. And so, however, slowly the repetition got the Greek word, like as though Moses is doing this is second time, Deuteronomy, the second law. Having said that, we are now in a beautiful chapter. I say that each time, but this really has my favorite saying, and it's called Shoftim, and it's about the actual judges. You see, this was the beginning of a people, a nation, setting out laws, courts of justice. And every society needs some means of government to maintain law and order. So the Torah's directive in the opening of this week's portion is to establish judges and police to enforce the law is not surprising. As the Mishnah writes, Pirkei Avot, pray for the peace of the government, for if not the fear of it, a man would swallow his friend alive. And I just want to read the opening lines to you tonight. Judges and officers shalt thou make thee in all thy gates. Again, Moses is telling them what they're going to do. This brand new generation who was born in the desert, who didn't know slavery, but equally they didn't know freedom. So he's guiding them in what to do. And this is the beginning of Western governance. All Western governance is based on Shoftim and our laws that we've already been reading before. So it says, in all thy gates which the Lord thy God giveth thee, tribe by tribe, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. So each of the 12 tribes, they had their separate courts, their separate judges. Thou shalt not wrest judgment. Thou shalt not respect persons, neither shalt thou take a gift. So the judges, and we just relate this in your mind to what we're going through today in the world with our courts. How many times have people who've strayed from the path of good governance tried to deliberately appoint a judge who would judge in favor of them? We saw it here with Zuma. We saw it in America with Trump. We saw it with Netanyahu. And here is this ancient wisdom telling the West how to govern. You shalt not take a gift, and there's a lovely story I've got about that. For a gift doth blind the eyes of the wise and pervert the words of the righteous. Now, here comes my favorite saying, which actually is the credo of Temple Israel Heritage Center. Justice, justice, tzedek, tzedek tirdov. Justice, justice thou shalt pursue, that thou mayest livest and inherit the land which the Lord thy God hath given thee. So I just would like to share a few words about this form of government and justice that was already lay down what righteousness truly means. Also, there was something confusing in the Torah's instruction because it writes, judges and police you should appoint lecha, for yourself. Now, the sages thought, why not for everyone? What does it mean for yourself? As this instruction is given to the entire Jewish people as a nation, waiting to go into the promised land, surely it should have been in the plural form lechem, referring to all of you. Why should this Torah give this commandment to the individual? Very, very interesting. Why? Because ultimately, it is the individual, not only the nation, who can sin, who can be unrighteous. What authority and power can each individual have to appoint judges, police, servants, etc. of the public? Well, of course, we know that we actually, in a way, do have a bit. But the stability of a society is highly dependent on law enforcement. But that doesn't guarantee success. Look in our country with our wonderful constitution. Look at all the crime, not only in our country, look at the world. Look at Russia, Ukraine. Look what's happening all over the world. Why can't the law and enforcement do its work? The Talmud states that while a judge may do his best to practice and enforce the law, the judge only has what his eyes see. He only knows what the evidence presented tells him. Crimes may be committed with impunity if there's no evidence of those crimes presented to law enforcement. Well, I know some of you are smiling when I say that even in spite of that evidence being presented in our era, we've gone insane. The evidence is presented in court, and with impunity, the people go on being corrupt, go on being unjust, go on stealing, go on hurting. How can that be? With impunity, leadership and people, everyday people, just ignore what is right or just, and all of us know this. It is inbuilt into the DNA of mankind, survival, depending on justice. How can that be? So, if so, what prevents members of society from committing crimes in private, hidden from the eyes of the law? Never, well, today you don't even have to hide them, but how about all those crimes? There's a lovely saying from an ancient Chabad source, that if only you were in fear of God or respect of God the way you are in fear of man when you break the law. For example, they point out that if someone, for example, maybe steals something or says something ugly, they quickly look around to see, is anyone watching me? If only we had the same understanding that Hashem is watching. People don't worry about that. We forget about that. But that's going to come up again now as we approach Rosh Hashanah and Elul, the month of Elul, where we've got to have a look at ourselves. It is much more important Hashem watching than people watching, and yet we ignore this. For this reason, the law was and is addressed to all and each individual in the Jewish nation, because Moses was saying, each of you have to be in awe of the truth of Hashem watching you, not only the law. The law catches where there's evidence, and Baruch Hashem for whistleblowers in our era, and many have given their lives for that, who have brought evidence of the truth. And as we know, the wheels of justice grind very, very, very slowly. Oh, oh. no, we won't go there. So let us carry on. And I've got a couple of two little stories to tell you of justice. How justice really depends on each and every one of us. Baruch Hashem, may we never get to that point where we commit a crime, get caught, and go to law. But the justice depends on when we are not seen. And one rabbi gave this example, which I found, wow, a little bit extreme. He said, I recently tried to pay for parking at a parking meter, and the machine system was frozen, and I wasn't sure it took my payment. Anyway, when I later got home, I realized I was never charged for the parking. So I innocently called up the number of the parking meter to try to pay over the phone. You can do this in the States. The administrator on the other end couldn't understand what I wanted to pay. You don't have to pay, was her response. Come on, you've just been lucky. That shows us, I know that's not important, but it shows us to what extent we are really immune to a certain extent to keeping God's justice when we're not seen. And there's just one other one, I don't know where I put it, but I want to share that with you. A rabbi at a yeshiva in Israel was teaching all his students, and he had lost his first wife, and they had had 5 children, and they came from a very, very poor family, probably in Bnei Brak, and they really were poor. And Baruch Hashem, ultimately, he found a wonderful woman as a mother to his children, and they had another 2 children. And these 2 children, of course, the rest were very grown up by then. This was years later. So God blessed him and gave him 2 young children with this lovely new woman, wife. But they were very, very poor. And his yeshiva students could see this. So they all collected money, and they bought a tricycle for the young son. I think he was only 3 or 4. For his birthday, he'd never been able to have a toy like that. And they brought it, and there was such joy in the home. I mean, this lovely rabbi and his wife and the young boy on the tricycle, oh, there was such excitement and joy. Anyway, the next week when the rabbi went back to the yeshiva to thank the students, he was also going to take their exam and give them marks. And he said, I cannot thank you enough for the joy you have brought to my family. Just to know that my son can have a tricycle, it was wonderful. He said, but you will forgive me. I have arranged for another rabbi to test you on the portion we're studying now. Because you see, my joy is such. I am so beholden to you. I'm so grateful that this might cloud my judgment of marking your exam. And I thought, what a beautiful way for us to understand why Tzedek Teardorf, justice you shall pursue, is repeated twice. And I said this before, the first justice is for the nation and the courts to uphold. The second justice is for ourselves to observe in our everyday interaction with each other, to be kind to each other, not to jump to a conclusion and project our fears and hurt on someone else and say, oh, well, are you challenging me? No. Listen, as we said before when we were talking about listen, but it's individual justice. I mean, can you imagine the neshama, the soul of that rabbi in Israel, probably in Bnei Brak, that he was so righteous, he would not allow himself to test his students for fear that his gratitude would cloud his judgment. And so let me just share a couple of other views of justice from other sages. Different rabbis over the ages, of course, translate words like tzedek, tzedek, tzedek to dov in light of their own experience. As you know, I love protecting those on the fringes. Like I'm always talking about helping African nationals. Now here, a group of rabbis called, and they ultimately got called Tagon on Kalus, interprets tzedek, tzedek, justice, justice shall you pursue, in another way. They interpreted it as truth, truth you shall pursue. And this is the example I find extraordinary, because if only politicians could understand this. So Rabbi Yaffe, 1928 to 2017, very much a current rabbinical source, pointed this out, that kindness and truth do not depart from you if you're aware of the justice of Hashem watching you, being with you. And Rabbi Yaffe continues, in several places in the Talmud we read, there was always, and I love this, a halachic dispute between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, as we know. But there were one or two odd occasions where Beit Hillel actually, at the conclusion of the discussion, you want to call it argument, discussion between Hillel and Shammai, at the conclusion, there were one or two odd occasions that Hillel changed his perspective and his students and actually agreed with Shammai. So then, what was the point at this stage in going back to Hillel's original points of view, when in conclusion he actually agreed? So what was the point? This Rabbi Yaffe says, the Rambam Maimonides explains that the purpose of even teaching the one or two rare discussions that they didn't agree on, which was always for the sake of heaven, but it teaches us the most important factor. It teaches us that one has to be truth-seeking. When the scholars of Beit Hillel heard the opposing view and recognized it as more correct, they did not hesitate to change their position. Can you believe that? I mean, what does that say? That's extraordinary. There's no harm in making mistakes. I'm not going to refer much, but I really think our president might have used that approach, or President Clinton also could have used that approach instead of denying things initially. And I'm not criticizing them because I've done it myself. All I'm saying is that it really shows the greatness of Hillel, that he was, and his students, that when the one or two occasions they realized the opposition, the other person was correct, they immediately withdrew and said, you are right, we are proud to have understood and agreed with you. I'll just say that I was shocked the other day when I was watching, I think it was ENCA, to hear Vavi from the labor movements. I'm not greatly a fan of his, but he looked at the camera and he said, you know something, I've got to admit I made a mistake. I was fully in support of the years of Jacob Zuma, Magashula, and all of them. I supported them. I made a mistake. I now realize with the evidence in court, I was wrong. And I thought, no matter what else that man does or says, that is a spark of greatness. So Rabbi Yaffe concludes, when a person pursues the truth, this is why they interpreted tzedek tzedek as the truth. His life is different. Pursuing the truth is really pursuing God. For we are taught that God's justice is the truth. And so and he goes on to say, let us make sure that our hearts, or the hearts of leaders, don't become so haughty over his brethren. And even if he doesn't turn from commandment right or wrong, right or left, he thinks so much of himself that you don't hear his wisdom. So again, we come back to Moses, his humility. Because even if you're just and you're righteous and you're arrogant with it, people don't hear the wisdom. So let me conclude with what Rabbi Hillel Lichtenstein, rabbi of Kolomea, Galicia, writes. He's obviously living today. We learn in Pirkei Avot, if one's fear of heaven precedes one's wisdom, the wisdom will always persist. Fear of heaven, respect, awe, is the foundation of remembering one's studies. So may I say, Baruch Hashem, that being for 2 years on Zoom, thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Marian, for bringing us as well the Shabbat services. It's really allowed all of us to get that much closer to true justice. And that is hearing that small voice inside you and knowing to be able to stop when you want to do something that is going to hurt someone else, because that will ultimately hurt you, but we've done it for so long. And now this repetition, this reading of Torah, this being with each other, this explaining can help us listen at every point to that small voice inside, which is the voice of justice. So to love truth, to love justice, is to love Hashem, and above all, to love each other. Shabbat Shalom. Back to you, Mariam.